Have more people joining us. It's already 2 o'clock. The time just flies by. So I'm going to go ahead and read my introduction and get started. So hello and welcome. My name is Alice Jansen and I'm the Education Director with the Texas Children in Nature Network. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. The webinar today is called The Dignity of Risk, Making Parks Fully Inclusive with Mark Davison. He's with the Park Planning, Design, and Construction Department. He's the manager of that area for the City of Boulder in Colorado. We also have Melody Alcazar with the City of Austin, who's helping us with our tech support, and she will also be taking attendance today. We do have automated closed captioning available for the webinar. You can click the Show Caption CC button on the Zoom toolbar for the live transcript options. We are recording our session today, so to save bandwidth, we ask that everyone turn off their cameras and mute themselves during the presentation. And I will be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, and you can share your questions there. I will be reading them out to Mark during the Q&A portion of the presentation, which we will have a couple of discussion timeframes during the presentation where you can share your questions and Mark will answer them. And then I also just want to remind everyone to be kind to each other when they're posting their questions and comments in the chat. I will also be sharing the recording link of today's session in a follow-up email. So if you are uncomfortable with your name showing, you can change your name to anonymous and then private message Melody with your name for our attendance. You can also change your name by hovering over your name in the participant list, and then you can click the 3 dots that appear to change your name. Also, if your Zoom name does not match the name you registered with, please change your name or private message Melody with your name. And this next part is very important, so listen carefully. Only registrants who attend the live webinar are eligible to receive a certificate of completion. We do not automatically send all attendees a certificate. You must request the certificate after attending the live webinar. The email you receive with the webinar Zoom link has these specific instructions for requesting the certificate. Attendance is taken during the live webinar, and we will check our attendance list to confirm your participation. And we need the name that you registered with to issue the certificate. All right, so I got all that out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and read our land acknowledgement. The Texas Children in Nature Network is headquartered in Austin, and as such, I am on the ancestral and unceded land of the Tonkawa, Comanche, and Sana people. Our ongoing colonial presence on indigenous lands compels us to take action now to counteract the effects of colonization. The work we do through the Texas Children in Nature Network is one small step towards that effort. I will also put some information in the chat to learn more about land acknowledgements and these indigenous peoples groups here momentarily. And I just want to thank you all for being here. And we have a very special webinar planned for you all today. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Mark to get started. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Alice. Welcome everybody today. As you heard, the title of the talk is The Dignity of Risk, Making Parks Fully Inclusive. And I am the planning manager for Parks and Recreation here in Boulder. And frankly, I've been in parks for about 30 years now. So if I don't know what else I could do, actually. I'd be pretty useless outside of parks nowadays. But the talk today is about how to make things inclusive. And the other aspect of my personal life is, as you can see from the picture here, my middle daughter, Lydia, experiences disability. And that's really what the talk's about today, is entwining some of those personal learnings with my professional experience. Apologies if my voice is a bit croaky. All my family have flu at the moment, and I'm so far the only one who's survived it. But I would like to thank Texas Children in Nature Network for inviting me today. I really appreciate it, especially Alice and Melody. Folks that have also helped with this talk today and the presentation are obviously my family itself. And the City of Boulder, especially folks like Darren Wagner, Senior Landscape Architect, and another colleague, Topher Downham, Engagement Coordinator. You'll see them pop up in the presentation. And there's a small group of us called Kinship who work together to make nature accessible for all children. And that is part of that group is Growing Up Boulder and CU Professor Louise Charla. So they're all part of this presentation. Just kind of why I got here, to be honest, I've done presentations in the past on parks, but it was about 18 months ago, the Children Nature Network asked if I'd write an article on accessibility. So it was the first time I'd really opened up about my personal life relating to my daughter and how that's changed my approach to planning, designing parks, and frankly, accessing nature. And it was funny, they asked me to write an article, and I ended up writing 30 pages, sorry. I think it was kind of like a therapeutic exercise. So they ended up splitting it into two articles, and the first one's really about placemaking, the design of spaces, and the second one's about the programming, space activation, and supporting children with disabilities. So that there's sort of the two themes run through aspects of the presentation today. And this is kind of really what I want to talk about. It's not in the exact order that it will appear, but it gives you a sense of what we're trying to get at today is this idea of the dignity of risk. It's risk taking by moving beyond basic codes, regs, and requirements that actually look to prevent risk from occurring. It's supposed to be about safety, but in the end, it takes away the dignity of people's choice to decide what they want to do and how they want to access nature and how we support that. And then it's aligning with nature itself. And this, you'll hear me talk about sensory experiences a lot, and that being, frankly, a way into universal design. And then that idea of designing itself. What are some of the simple things we can do that can be a game changer for how folks with a disability, especially children, can access the outdoors, parks? And then the last part is talking about this idea of play and diversified play. You'll see that I've put in four aspects of that. I'll talk about it later, but I have to give credit to Adam Bienenstock, who I've been working with for a couple of years now. And I think Adam's actually given a talk for you guys, but he's really a leader on thinking about how we start to rethink what play looks like. So this is maybe if we're in a movie, this would be a little bit of the sad part of the movie. This was here, the sort of beginning of my life with my family. You see in the boy in the middle of the picture is Jack. He's our oldest son. Our youngest daughter, Momi, isn't around at this point, but Lydia was born. She's 11 years old now. She's going to be 12 next week. It was when she was about 6 months. We started to see some things going on. And you'll see there, my wife, Danae, wrote a blog. It's called Lydia Unicorn. And for Danae, that was incredibly therapeutic to write about Lydia. But some of the things we started to see when she was 1 year old was like 200 seizures a day. She's non-verbal, non-mobile. We actually went to see a specialist when she was 3, and they told us she wouldn't get past the 6 years of age. And so from that, you can imagine as parents, it really changed our lives and, makes you realize what's important about life, let's say. And to this day, Lydia's undiagnosed, learning some verbal communication, still non-mobile, still has about 100 seizures a day, but she's alive, kicking, and I'll explain the good parts in a moment. But what I wanted to point out here is that this is definitely the medical side of things with Lydia. It's not Lydia, it's just the way kids are, unfortunately, in the disability world, often labeled through medical terminology, which frankly is frightening and often puts the fear of God into parents. And that's another talk we could give for another time. Trying to describe what it's like living in a family where the middle kid experiences disability and how you become a family is really interesting. But I'm just going to pause for a moment because this is Jack, oldest son, when he was 11. And you hadn't really spoke about Lydia, but you can see at school the teacher asked him to write a poem, just general poems. And this poem came out about Lydia. And I think it really talks about two things. And my wife refers to this, Danae, as being kind of the incredible joy and also the credible fear you can have in this sort of environment where you've got a medically complex child. And you can see there coming out from Jack is both that sense of fear, but also that love and beauty he has for his sister, which is kind of beautiful. I think as we get into this talk today, one thing that's really important for me was all parents with kids with disabilities, you have this expectation, of course, of what your child's going to be, and you have to completely change that expectation. In some ways, Danae and I's life now for the rest of our lives will be a caregiver, for example, 24/7, 365 days a year. So how do you even come to terms with something as simple as that? Well, as complicated as that. And one of my biggest saddest thoughts in the early years of Lydia was this idea was Lydia would never see a sunset. She also has cortical vision impairment, which means her eyes are perfect, but her brain can't process things. But she has gone from a 0 out of 10 to a 2 out of 10, which means she can now see shadows and lights and colors. And I was working with the Anchor Center for the Blind, where Lydia went to preschool, and I was explaining to them that I couldn't see a sunset, and they'd work with her on this light board you can see on the right. And I always remember the first times Lydia smiled, and she gives a huge beaming smile. When she does, it's amazing. It was when the light board lit up and sort of went across that spectrum on the left to different colors. And that's when I realized, and Lydia, after that, gave that huge smile. I was like, oh, Lydia's seen her first sunset for the first time. And that was when I think my brain shifted in terms of accepting Lydia for who she was, but starting to think about the ways Lydia can connect with this world and how we can make that happen without it being, frankly, overly complicated and having parallels with a world in which we find easy to access. So that's why this is called the dignity of risk. And it's the fact that it's not about fragility. It's about universal disability being wild and out there full of novel mutations. And that's actually the final part of the diagnosis Lydia got, was that she did have a novel mutation, which actually enabled us to eventually have our third daughter. And so you see here Lydia as herself, blue tongue. She loves lollipops. You can see that beautiful smile on the left, and her assistant's dog Gromit. And in the last year, she's trying to use the talker. She hasn't achieved that yet, but all the different ways Lydia's starting to become part of this world and enjoy it. So, in other words, in thinking about play and how we get kids with disabilities out in the play, it isn't, I want to think of it in terms of rather than segregating kids with disabilities, like for instance, they're currently segregated in the school classroom, why can't we make play inclusive, outside, and natural? And that's just a quick pause here. I'm very curious. We started doing this exercise when I used to work at Oregon State Parks in 2008, when we started doing nature play. And I'm curious in the text box, or just to shout out, if there's any sort of typical favorite memories from your first time in nature and what that activity might have been. So I'll just pause there to see if there is any thoughts. And if you'd like to read them out, Alice.
Okay, I'm looking, somebody says tree climbing, watching banana spiders weave their webs under our fig tree. Mine is laying in freshly mown grass,
Mm.
playing in the mud, discovering flowers and seeing birds waiting in the morning light at the shore edge, riding my bike and going to the beach, playing in the mud, picking and eating wild berries, looking at sheet lighting, or sorry, sheet lightning, exploring our 200-acre farm and creating names and stories of the different area. One had awesome coffee beans, which was eroded topsoil.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry, go
there's a
on.
lot. I'll read a couple more. As an autistic woman, I will say that being out hiking was a wonderful sensory experience. Doodle bugs or roly polies, playing inside the giant fig tree. So there's a lot of really nice ones.
I love it. No, I think this has always been my favorite exercise. You always feel inspired coming away from it. And in the next slide, um, you'll see, and it's kind of this idea that if we start to think about those childhood memories and that being, real play, what would it look like for a child experiencing disability? And a couple of my friends over there, DJ and Marshall, the parents are friends of ours, and DJ has issues working with vision and then also walking. And we try to, and often when we go out on our roll and strolls, I start to think about that, oh, that's interesting, our first childhood memories. For instance, someone mentioned climbing a tree, which is something I love to do myself, my youngest daughter does. But for Lydia, that gets a bit tricky, doesn't it, to think about how that would happen. Whereas someone mentioned lying in the mown grass and looking up at the light, and I'll talk about that later actually with Lydia, how easy that is to make happen playing in the mud. And so what are these things from these memories of how we played naturally can we apply today in terms of sort of a universal access to nature? And the final thing I'll finish on with old play is just this concept. This is Peter Bruegel, a Flemish painter for 1560. And I don't know if folks have seen this picture before, but it's 250 children doing 90 forms of play. And you'll notice there's not a single play structure in there. And this is something, you probably hear me emphasize today, that we've probably over concentrated on these tiny little play areas with a few features that doesn't actually reflect how children naturally want to play. And frankly, how you expressed yourselves in your own memories is more closer probably to this type of play than the prefabricated playgrounds we have today. And then within that, today there is that spectrum, like I mentioned, where we're kind of here with these playgrounds that are frankly pretty boring and focus on gross motor versus nature-themed play or true nature play or even free play out in the wild. And how do we also, again, make that universally accessible? So I'll spend a little bit of time, about 5 minutes, just talking about some of the barriers I've experienced with Lydia, um, both real and some of them perceived. And in all honesty, some of them have been pretty painful. Uh, but I think it helps explain, like, what is it called nowadays? The trendy word is the lived experience, isn't it? And here's an example. It's not the park I was at, but it's a park in Boulder near where the park I was at. And I once took Lydia and Momi out. Momi being, at that time, maybe 5 years old, Lydia being about 9. And Momi ran straight at the swings, of course, and was on the swings. The park had a concrete path like this one. So I pushed Lydia around on the wheelchair and ran her fast and did spins because Lydia loves to go fast, loves spinning. And after that, we just sat down on the bench and waited for Momi because the two of us obviously were segregated from Momi at that point. And then Momi started to cry because she's 5 years old and she wanted to push on the swings. And I didn't want to leave Lydia because at that point, Lydia obviously, unfortunately, had had one of her DMs, her bowel movements. And it was a pretty big one. And I'm like, I'm going to have to change a diaper. But I thought, all right, I'll drag Lydia over. But I got stuck in the actual wood chips. The chair got stuck. And I'd never like to leave Lydia like that because she really is crying her eyes out. So at this point, I have both daughters crying. And I thought, so I finally dragged Momi off the swing and drag Lydia's chair out, and Momi helps me. And I have to change Lydia's diaper, which is in the parking lot just next to the play area. And I put her in the back of the car, and unfortunately, it had got everywhere. So I lifted Lydia up, and she actually ended up peeing on my legs. And there was poo everywhere, and Momi's crying in the back seat. And I remember two parents passed with their kids, and I just got this look of disgust or shock, or I couldn't quite tell what it was, but it definitely wasn't welcoming. And the only reason I was in that position was because there wasn't a changing table in the bathroom for a 60-pound child. And a barrier as simple as that can lead to one of the worst experiences you have. And I remember the three of us going home crying. And I told my wife, and we sat there as a family and said, we need to do something different about this. We can't have this keep happening to us. So that was probably a big changing point in my life. You'll see here on the left is examples of what is called ADA, accessible play. This is supposed to be the standard by which children with disabilities can access play. Yet you'll see on the right examples of Lydia out there, and I'll talk a little bit more about the adaptive mobility devices that are emerging that are so cool. This is an axiom. I can get Lydia anywhere in that chair. I can spin her around. I can swing her around. I can make her go fast. And yet on the left, you'll see the bottom image shows it's actually in the ADA guidelines for ADA access to playgrounds. And basically, it's plastic mats. And it's almost painfully tempting for a kid like Lydia because how would she get up the steps? The mats get her there, and yet she can't do the experience. And then the one on the top left, in many ways, is even worse. And I'll talk about sensory inputs. It's got the off-gassing from the artificial turf. It has, in terms of like the smell, there isn't really a proper swinging motion on it that Lydia likes, which is the spinning around. And frankly, she gets locked in. She doesn't like being locked in. And that is a like passable piece of ADA equipment, but doesn't meet anywhere near as good as the way on the right images show in terms of the smells of the grass, the play of light in terms of her sight, the hearing, the sound of wind or the bird calls that she loves. So you can just see here what I'm trying to point out is it feels like focused playgrounds and play has become so confined and so safe, it isn't enjoyable anymore. There's no dignity or risk within that. And so I won't spend long on this, and I think I've shared a PDF with Alice that I'm happy for folks to see because it's just suggestions in here. And the only one I'll point out is the second one. A lot of ADA trails that are being built are accessible, which are 10-foot wide, but that in itself is really boring for a child. And there's no sensory inputs, and they tend not to have a viewpoint. They just end at like a bridge where you can't get more accessibility. So we need to sort of rethink our approach to ADA to really, frankly, it was useful at the time when there was the original movement to get ramps and signage, which was all about wheelchairs and being able to read signs, and so people would allow for parking, for example. An incredibly useful and important movement in the disability world. But when we're trying to talk about accessing nature or parks, frankly, the ADA guidelines don't provide anything that we need. And in some ways, like creating a 10-foot wide path, create more barriers for us and prevent adventurous play for Lydia. And what that often does is lead to feeling excluded. I think this diagram here, I don't need to talk about it much, but it's interesting to me that as a family now, I will go out with Lydia, whereas my wife will take Jack and Momi out somewhere. So our family is often segregated in terms of our ability to access things in the outdoors because I've got to take Lydia on the ADA thing, whereas Danae will take Momi and Jack on the other thing, and Momi and Jack won't want to do the ADA thing because it's so boring. So often what we're seeing is this segregation even within families and then segregation of the disability community. And that's something I'm hoping we can really overcome. So after thinking about the barriers and how we overcome those, the other thing really started to think about is this idea of, well, what type of program could occur to support it? And what I mean by that is it's interesting in schools, like Lydia has a pair at school, a support person, and that's sort of legally required, along with a teacher to give Lydia extra support at school. And I've always been wondering, like, well, why don't we kind of have a pair program for parks or nature? And I'd love someone to invent that, if anyone's willing. But it is true that all of us at some point in our lives experience disability, even if it's in a temporary basis. So why don't we all, once we've thought about that experience and the ways we weren't able to access certain things, can we get together and focus on universal programming? A few of the things we've been doing here in Boulder, which I'm, kind of proud of, to be honest, is this idea of adaptive mobility devices. For example, instead of designing a trail and spending it's $1 million to $2 million for a 1 mile concrete trail now that's ADA standard. Instead, we could spend money on these adaptive devices, which we've done now in Boulder, and we keep them at our ranger cottage, and we make them available to anyone who wants to use them. And you can see there, like I mentioned, the Axiom, Lydia has that. The cost is quite prohibitive. There is grants, but sometimes they're hard to get. We managed to get one for the Axiom. But it's not available to all parents, and there's a huge markup, unfortunately, still for disability equipment. But that's where city departments come in, like parks departments. We can afford to buy these things and make them available for any parent who wants to use them. They just have to call up and we'll bring the kid along and we'll do practice exercises. And you'll see there in the bottom right image on the left, Topher Downham, he's the colleague I mentioned earlier. He's an open space outdoor education coordinator. And he will offer any of these programs to anyone at any time. And it's huge in terms of giving parents not only a chance to access nature, but also to build confidence. And then here's the thing I mentioned in terms of integrated and focused programming. We really have found that a lot of the disability programming I've done in the past has been great, like on the right, the wheelchair demonstration hike, but it also ends up being, because it's not integrated, it can make you feel somewhat isolated as a disability community member. So we need the focus programs in when it's things like how do you access the outdoors and what mobility devices are there. Whereas the focus on the left is more trying to integrate families across the board. So it's just bearing that in mind as you develop programming, not to make it exclusive, but to make it focused and at other times integrated. And that's I've sort of found to be a really good way to think about creating sort of a whole community. Here's Sarah, one of our community connectors. We had community connectors in the City of Boulder, initially focused on racial equity. And now this Sarah was the first disability equity community connector. And she started to provide us with advice for community meetings, like creating here a sensory zone. And what you see here was Sarah working with Darren Wegner, who I also mentioned earlier, creating our first ever safe route to parks. And in that, working with the disability community to ensure it was also accessible as well as safe. And then here you see Sarah talking about things like as we bring people in from the disability community to more meetings, we don't just think about the accessibility, we think about the communication and what that might look like and allow for expression of that to occur in a very open environment. Well, obviously, I think this is, I don't need to talk about much this, but to make sure that there's information for folks before they go out. So we've built a website around that. And then finally, probably the biggest success in terms of the programming has been the roll and strolls. Topher and I started them about 4 years ago. One roll and stroll, we had about 78 folks, and we wondered if we should just make it a march to the town hall to get some policy changed. Instead, we just had a lovely hike along the, in this case, Clear Creek Canyon. And the important thing about the roll and strolls is I sort of make a joke about it because my wife and I have a joke. We get about 90 minutes every couple of weeks to go out for a couple of pints. And we call it a war pint, peace pint. The first pint, we can have a great argument with each other. The second pint, we can talk about things that will help us in our lives. So roll and stroll is often an out and back where we call it war stroll on the way out, where you complain about Medicaid. And on the way back, you talk about the positive things you can do in your life. And it's become a wonderful part of the sort of kinship community that's developed around us. And what I like about it is you'll have parents who've been in the disability community with their children for, say, 10, 20 years. And as the new parents come on board, they can often be mentors for them in a very natural way. I've also noticed that, as you know, in nature, it calms your senses. I'll see the dads that I'm talking with, because they're strolling and moving their arms in nature and hearing nature sounds, feel more relaxed, will often reveal more than they would in a more like circular seating type situation, for example. And maybe my last point here is what's interesting is over the years, we've recognized that the hikes typically are like 1 to 2 miles long is the ideal length. And we often get strung out, but we always wait for the last person. But it means at that 1 to 2 miles, it's about the maximum parents can do. And we always make sure we have 30 minutes for coffee and cookies at the beginning, because there's always going to be one parent, like I mentioned earlier, where there's a diaper change or something falls off the wheelchair. We had that last week. And so you need to make sure that you give that time for folks to arrive and gather. So the bottom line of the programming is that idea of fostering kinship in nature, and especially for parents, can we also create that idea of pairers to support people as they go outside, especially department-wise, or instead of having system-wide programs, you can have more individualized programs. So I'm just curious, I'll just pause a second. I'm curious if anyone's either dreamed of or also tried integrated programming, because honestly, we're still learning here. And it's great to hear other people's thoughts on the way they've integrated programming for kids with disabilities. And
All
if there's
right.
anything, Alice, yeah, thanks, Alice.
Yes. Yes. So please go ahead and put your responses to this question in the chat. And we did have a question pop up while people are putting their responses in the chat that I'll read out, Mark. It says, I used to work a hiking desk where I used to help people plan for hikes. How would you recommend people plan for going on hikes in these wheelchairs? Because they can't be accessible on every trail, can they? Like Long's Peak in Colorado.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's a few things I've mentioned here is there is the traveling gnomes. And so there's groups emerging now, and the traveling gnomes is based out of Denver, Colorado. And what they'll do is you can call up the traveling gnomes and they will figure out a way as a nonprofit to provide access into nature. And there's also Jeremy Lockwood, the Lockwood Foundation. They will actually get people up to the top of Longs Peak. And what he does is he works with CU students who also volunteer. My daughter Lydia's been with them, helping them train with their chairs. They've got specially adapted chairs. And about once a month, once every 2 months, they'll basically ensure, in fact, that's for all, mostly for youth, but all ages, uh, they will actually make sure anyone can get any peak they want. And there'll be about 30 people volunteer. The traveling gnomes is more just getting folks out into nature, less of the peak climbing, more along the trails. And also, like I mentioned, there's amazing adaptive devices there if departments start to purchase those. And actually, Boulder County's just produced its first accessible trail hikes website. So all I'm saying here is I'm seeing a bunch of different sort of lenses looking at this issue of providing accessibility and coming at it from like that volunteer support perspective, the website perspective, or the mobility device. And all of them are working really well. It's just making sure someone's able to sort of coordinate those efforts.
Thanks, Mark. Can you repeat the name of the organization that you mentioned that helps folks climb up the mountain peaks? Jeremy?
Yeah, Jeremy Lockwood Foundation. Actually, can I admit that I often get names wrong?
Oh, that's okay.
I know Jeremy well, so you'll kill me if I get it wrong. Yeah, if you just type in the Lockwood Foundation, and then I'll just do the Traveling Gnomes again because it's such a fun name to say.
It is fun. Awesome. And we can share these links in our follow-up email.
Yeah.
So we do have some responses here. Let's see. Well, a lot came in. So someone mentions that there's a lovely park in Grapevine, Texas, with a wheelchair accessible playground.
Hmm.
Fishing activities with adaptive fishing poles. Outdoor yoga and movement activities that are wheelchair accessible, but have able-bodied people interacting and doing partner poses with people in wheelchairs. That sounds super fun.
Hmm.
Other programs I'm aware of, Birdability. I'm interested in getting ideas, brainstorming with parents, caregivers, and youth to hear their ideas about what is important. Let's see. One question that has arisen in programs is from participants who are deaf and those with low vision, asking how they can communicate with each other.
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Go ahead.
no, it's funny because that's an example where, like, we've on the Rolling Stores we have a mix of the range of children on the spectrum of disabilities, and I'll just be very honest, that is one of the hardest things to do. But I mentioned earlier Anchor Center for the Blind, sorry, which was Lydia's preschool, and they did very simple things like all the children again. It was Anchor Center for the Blind, but it was a complete spectrum of kids with disabilities. And they do simple things like bury all the kids together in leaves up to their necks. And so there was touch, and there was sort of through the sensories, different senses having similar experiences. So there isn't a great way, of no, I haven't found yet a way to create that perfect communication, but it's more so from the anchor's perspective, it was more creating these type of situations where the senses could be stimulated and shared was the way they were managing that. But that's a tough one. But
Mm-hmm.
the other examples, I love the yoga. Yeah, we do this the fishing one, VJ, one of our outreach coordinators. And it's interesting because I think it points to that idea we're going way beyond just, the idea of it along a nature trail or in a playground. There's a lot of innovative ways to think of play that actually is kind of the next part of the talk.
Right. There were a couple of other comments here. Our programming includes short caving trips, and we have VR caving headsets to recreate the same cave environment for folks who are unable to get into the cave. I'm curious to find a way to run this programming without that separation and more integration.
Yeah, no, to me, it all comes back to I've noticed a lot of because the medical profession will often tell the parents that their child is medically fragile, then the parents won't almost enable their children to have that dignity of risk. So one of the barriers is working with the parents to see that the risk can be actually really healthy in terms of childhood development. And like I mentioned earlier, for something like caving, I could see something like the Traveling Gnomes or the Lockwood Foundation, where you're gathering up 20 to 30 volunteers to make something happen. that's been the sort of, and I know that takes a lot of effort, but these nonprofits are out there doing the work now, and they've really expanded in the last 5 years. And that seems to be the best way to provide that support because typically, like a department like ours, I wouldn't be able to get the money to get like 30 people to turn up for an event. You know what I mean? It just wouldn't be in the program funding. So those nonprofits seem to be filling that sort of niche at the moment.
Hmm. Right. There's a few more. We've just started integrating visually impaired activities during our creative arts blocks at
Hmm.
camp, but I dream of having more access to and in our camp for campers and families.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
ran a, oh, go ahead.
no, please, what was the other one?
I ran a weekly social group for children on the autism spectrum in our school garden. Also, a weekly group with children in the life skills program, lots of different abilities, and we mostly focus on sensory experiences, lap
Hmm.
bends, dappled light changes, various plant interactions, etc.
Oh, I love that. That's whoever that was. I've got a very similar thing coming up in the talk. So
Oh, good.
one thing I'd mentioned is this is interesting, and because my wife works with disability nonprofit, and I'll give an example that one of the ladies she works with sometimes uh, was in a put into a mental institution because she experienced disability, and the only way she could get out was being sterilized. And I don't say that to be dramatic because I think it's about 30 states still legally have it on their books that uh, children with disability, females, can still legally be sterilized to not have children from the fear that there'd be more children with disability, which obviously is ridiculous, but it's where we were in the 70s, even parts of the early 80s. And I say this because then in the 90s, there was a big fight for parents to get their children into schools. And during that time, I mean, to this day, Lydia's still in a segregated classroom from the rest of the kids, but at least she's at school. And it's sort of in the 2000s when parents mostly had kept their kids indoors, mostly due to stigma, like 2010s. And this is, this is my wife and I talking about the history of this, of like, hey, our kids are at home now. They're going to school, but how do we get outside? And I've noticed even in Lydia's 11 years, over the last few years, there's like an explosion in parents saying, hey, we want our kids with disabilities to access the outdoors. And I've kind of noticed an explosion in individual programs like the Gnomes or whoever starting to service those needs. And the only way I can explain it is it's happening really, really organically with all like these wonderful programs you folks have just mentioned. Hopefully, at some point, someone can gather all this up and share it so that there is knowledge instead of all these brilliant individual things. There's knowledge of how we can share all these ideas and maybe coordinate around them. And frankly, that's the biggest issue in the last 10 years is as parents have realized, yet we got through the school thing, we got out the mental institution, but nothing is designed for kids to get outdoors with disabilities. So we've got to sort of retrofit it. And I think that's like the next big challenge for the disability movement. I think I'll get off my soapbox there and continue with the talk, if that's all right.
Go for it.
All
Yeah.
right, this is kind of the just the last part. And it's this idea of going from confined play to free play. And what you'll see here, this method, mentioned being in parks quite a while, and I thought about the design process, and we design all the stuff I've done prior to Lydia. I'm happy to say I did wrong from a disability access perspective. I didn't have a clue, and I don't blame myself there. I just didn't know. And it made me realize that when we design a program or play features or trails, we do it, and then we expect an activity to occur on it. Like a few folks mentioned different activities you do. Then there's an emotional response, and that's based upon sensory inputs. And this is where I've been lucky enough to work with Louise Charla at CU, and she's wrote some fantastic articles on children accessing nature. I'd really recommend, like, this kind of inspired me. And luckily, she's in a group of us who have conversations about this, and she's been inspiring. But it made me realize that we probably want to reverse engineer the design process. And maybe we start with sensors, emotions, activities, and end up with a design. And that's been like a huge change in my life. And what I mean by that is, if you think about ADA or even universal design, it all points to building a thing and then allowing that activity for the child with disability to occur. And it's kind of unfortunately kind of the wrong way around, I realized, for Lydia, because it doesn't do any good. Like that early accessible swing I showed you, that's really boring. It's 1 foot off the ground. It goes slightly forwards and backwards, and she's locked in it. It's no good for a child experiencing disability like Lydia. And it's no one's fault. It's just the rules are like that. So this is where I got a little bit excited, to be honest. And this is where we've, in Boulder anyway, started to use this process now. And like I mentioned earlier, folks like Adam Bienenstock from Canada, the nature play designer, they're all helping us pull this together. There's another person, Michelle Mathis from Learning Landscapes in Oregon, where I used to work, is also helping us. And there's some great consultants really starting to think about this. And they were we've been showing them this process and they're moving on board with it. And you can see here, if we start with the senses, and I've been told there's 9. It's not my area of expertise. I know there's 5. I've learned this about the 6th, but there's 9 in total. And you'll see there's a sound, sight, touch, smell, taste. And each of those I've assigned something that Lydia enjoys. And someone mentioned that earlier, the sight piece. Her sight, you can see dapple shade, and you see that they're on the ground in a forest. She's having a little nap, but prior to that, she'd really been enjoying that play of light and shade in the tree canopy above. And I often say, wouldn't it be wonderful if we take this approach with sensory first, when we design, eventually build the trail, we'd have little, instead of benches along the trail, we'd also have little mats that are really comfy, which you could put a blanket on. And Lydia would be able to take her out the wheelchair and lie on that mat and look up at the trees. And part of that is someone like Lydia always has peripheral vision because she never got to move her neck like most babies do, and then the vision gets centered. So her vision has always stayed peripheral so she can look around. And so when she's in a wheelchair, she mostly just sees the ground because her head's bobbing forward. So she can never look up into the canopy. So these little mats with blankets on them would provide Lydia ways and her comrades of looking up into the canopy for kids who don't have mobility, full mobility and movement. And the only reason I thought about that design was because of thinking about that sensory input. And it's interesting when you start to think about it, because touch can be feet in the water. Number 3, and this is a fantastic trailhead in Colorado. Jeffco Open Space designed it, where they made sure it was accessible into the creek. And they did it in a way where you didn't have like a big concrete ramp. They've just gently did it using a resin that allows you to get down there. But it's that idea of, how do we access water to get that sense and then do the design afterwards? And obviously with that, you'll see on the right, there's an emotions wheel where we're starting to look at, well, what emotional responses would come from that. And as we've got into that, we've been working with local schools. And this example isn't just for kids with disabilities, for all kids, where when we're in that green space, exciting, happy, it's kind of the safe space. But what we're not allowing for in our play or access to the outdoors is that uncomfortable space. And I've been working with a few different folks, psychologists and people like Louise, where what's happening is you'll see the red on the bottom right is crying. Kids are going straight from safe to overwhelmed, and uncomfortable, like brave and determined, is where the balance beam, I didn't circle that one, is where all the learnings occurring. So, and that's that dignity of risk, like allowing Lydia to bounce along a trail up and down, and she's getting jiggled. So it's stimulating a vestibular sense, and she's just crying with laughter. Isn't something, for instance, that 10-foot concrete ADA trail would ever provide for it. So this is why I feel like this sensory and emotional approach is having a big success. My final point on the emotional stuff, what's interesting, I've discovered it doing there's tons of these wheels out there, you go on the internet. I've noticed a lot of them, 3/4 of them are fear-based or feeling sad or, and it's interesting that some of the better emotional wheels I've discovered kind of half and half. So they allow for that, let's just say that safe space and also that uncomfortable space, but more balanced. And these have been really helpful when we work with kids and sort of thinking through, for example, with Lydia, I know Lydia won't have that full range of emotions in terms of the way she expresses herself. It might be happening internal, I'm sure it is, but the way she expresses her emotions probably are closer to 5 or 6. So I've started to think about ways to adapt these emotional wheels for kids with disabilities so we can truly understand emotional responses tied to sensory inputs. And then from there, you'll see that we then start to think about the various activities that tie to those sensory inputs and emotional responses in terms of all the different activities that can occur. And once we get through that, that's when we can finally start the design. And my final point on the design here would be that we've changed from that confined play space, the prefab 5 features, which nowadays can cost like 500 to 800,000, to these mile-long trails where we've got nature pods off them. And what's beautiful about that is this is an example of when I built a Silver Falls is even someone like Lydia who might not be able to access all the features, she'll still enjoy being in nature along a 1 mile soft surface trail, having more, close, which is only, let's just say 2 foot wide, 3 foot wide. So she's closer to be able to touch the grasses or there's trees, the smell of the trees along the trail. So it can still have that nature participation, even if she can't use all the features. And then just the final part of my talk, and this is what I've been developing with Adam, is moving away, like I mentioned, from that one at the top, the gross motor, to 4 types of natural play. And if we take these 4 types along with the sensory and emotional inputs, you can almost forget about ADA design. You can forget about universal design. It just becomes these areas work for all kids as long as you start to think about what are the accommodations needed. And a simple example is a typical prefab play area at the moment would have, let's say, 100 kids. And Adam was telling me that A-type kids would spend 20 minutes dominating that play, about 20 of them, while the 80 watch on. And his experimentations are showing with these 4 types of play, all kids will play in them, the whole 100 kids, and they'll stay for about an hour, 20 minutes. In fact, the parents are like having to drag their kids away at the end. So it's as well as gross motor, there's fine motor, which is loose parts, sand and water, drawing. There's then creative and collaborative, this idea of outdoor classrooms, stages, games. Quiet and contemplative, like tight tree groupings where kids can kind of hide and chill out. Hillocks, sometimes you want to be contemplative, looking out over something, not just hiding. Caves, and then my excellent spelling, small gathering areas. And obviously being able to sleep. And there you just see the gross motor skills and you see some of the activities I've done with Lydia. And in fact, I know I'm getting close to time, so I'll speed through these a bit. But, simple things for gross activities for Lydia are taking like that right picture on the right is sledding down a hill at full speed. And that is that dignity of risk. She might fall out a few times, but she absolutely loves it. It's one of those things that gets her really motivated is that sense of jiggling, which what I'm trying to get at is very difficult to do in a play area. And if we could think of that idea of a para supporting that, we can really start to make experiences for kids that are in terms of all abilities. The fine motor skills, we haven't talked about this today, but we all love the community garden, and you'll see on the top left there, Lydia's friend, allowing her to touch and feel the vegetables. The bottom left of her sister, helping her plant the seeds and feel the seeds. And on the right is her assistant's dog Gromit, and there's a great example. Gromit's trained, because Lydia has clawness in her hands, to lick inside her hands, which causes her to lose the tension and release some of the clawness. And if that's not an example of outdoor play, obviously, but it's just such a little innovative way of thinking about how to make life for kids like Lydia more accessible, more enjoyable, and help with things like fine motor. And then creative and collaborative. This is the sense of outdoor classrooms. You'll see the Roland strolls, which I've mentioned. And then on the bottom left is our latest creation, which is an outdoor classroom for Crestview, which costs us $14,000 because we're doing all this work in-house now and making sure it's accessible. You'll see to the right of the board is a little log that's basically a stopper for where a couple of wheelchairs can go. And then on the bottom right, you'll see the shadows where there's also a place for shade. Lydia can't control her temperature, for example. So that's a wonderful spot for some kids who can't control temperature, whereas the other spot is those who want to be a bit more in the limelight. So it's also thinking about how we balance those needs across the spectrum. And then quiet and contemplative. I always think that's my favorite picture, my order. And it's that example I've explained of her looking up at the canopy. But the thing on the bottom right, I just want to show you is wonderful because that's one of the local nature play areas. And basically, it's a deck which isn't attached to anything, built around three trees, and it's at three levels. And even though this wasn't done on purpose, it was just happenstance, you'll notice that myself, Lydia, and Jack are kind of at eye level because of the three layers. Momi, who's in the background, you can't see her, she's running up and down those platforms, so that's a play structure for her. And as I relax, if I've got Lydia in my line like that, and you can see that's her peripheral vision she's using there on the bottom right of her eyes, it means I can actually fall asleep and get a quick nap. No, I'm just joking. It means that we are all connected as a family. We're not separated in this accidental play space. And I always think that's just one of the beautiful examples of how we can be more thoughtful. So I realized with the spectrum of disability, I myself can get overwhelmed. So I've thought of some simple steps. And this is Lydia's wildometer. So you can see that I created this accidentally about 15 years ago for a wilderness park and have adapted it. So Lydia has urban, local parks, nature, wilderness, and I've got all the activities I can do with Lydia in those areas. And my goal is to get her from the green arrow on the left over to the right and do that. And then once I got her there, I can now pick and choose her experience within that, backyard, the backcountry experience. And that's been a real fun thing for our family to have that. And I almost think afterwards, like, well, maybe both my other siblings should have, both my other children should have this wild animal, and maybe every child should, because it's been such fun to do. I won't go through this list, but this is a list of some great things that I've seen emerge here in Boulder and things we've thought about. Even letterboards at the entrances to play areas, even if they're not for all kids, it's anyone with a parent with disability suddenly feels welcome. Remember that earlier story I had about the changing with Lydia? Just that sense of welcomeness is so huge. And then this is what I started with in the presentation, just summarizing dignity of risk, sensory rich experiences, you know, designing holistically, thinking about the 60-pound changing table, and finally that sort of four types of play. And that's what I wanted to point out. Like a 6 to 12-year-old play area can be anywhere from $800,000 to $1.2 million and it's all gross motor, whereas that creative and social one cost us $14,000 and did 10 times more in terms of providing universal access than a prefab play area would. So that's kind of the end of the talk. I was just wondering if you could create your old wildometer, how would you use it and different ways you could use it. And frankly, just wanted to say thank you for listening today.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful, and we appreciate you sharing your experiences and your story and your ideas. Someone asked a couple of couple of slides back if you could show the slide. I think it might have been the one with the wild, not sure which slide. It might have been that one, the wildometer. But I will be sharing the slides out as a PDF in the follow-up email. And there are some comments in the chat. So I'm actually going to go up to the section where we were taking comments because someone had one about Special Olympics, which was interesting.
Oh.
So this is from Melissa. Any thought to partnering with Special Olympics to add outdoor recreation activities? They have a large reach in the disability community.
Yeah, it's funny. One of my best friends works on the supports that committee, and yeah, I would love it. For example, I mean, I kind of joke, but it would be like how many diaper changes a day would be a Special Olympics event. Lydia's at my wife now at 36,000, so that would be for the parents, obviously. But I say that in a humorous nature, but it would be really fun to think about, like instead of using the typical events. You can see I've thought about this at the Special Olympics, like sprinting, ball games, you name it, jumping. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they said, actually, let's make adaptive events that are kind of fun? So that might be like, frankly, who can lie under the dappled shade of a tree for the longest and give the most smiles? Like, and I know that maybe sounds a bit, what's the word, soppy, I don't know, but it would just to be, I think to the person's point, to be really thoughtful about those sensory inputs and those emotions and then the activities. It would be lovely to think about creating Olympics that thinks that way rather than that more sort of typical competitive gross motor way.
Yeah, that's super fun. Some folks here can help make that happen.
Yeah.
There's there's a comment from Kathleen. When I removed the play structure from my class playground, replacing it with loose parts, tree stumps, boulders, etc., the children ended up playing more with less conflict. It allowed the children to run around, dig, build, look for insects and mushrooms, lie in the grass, in the shade, etc.
Oh, it's so interesting, isn't it? That's that thing. One a great thing you can do is where you make the kids take their shoes and socks off and walk. First off, you make them walk across a log with their sneakers on, and they really struggle because they're flat-footed. And then you ask them to walk across that log on the ground without their sneakers and socks. And because our feet are like that, the feet grip and you walk like this, and they're so much more stable. So the kids immediately realize how uh, that direct contact with nature and the way our bodies are adapted to be with nature is a great example. And there's a good example. It's actually safer to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. There was a lot of great comments. Let's see. So Zach has a comment related to a lot of these sensations and preferences discussions. There is a small body of evidence showing the neuronal responses of nature exposure based on interaction with natural characteristics of the environment. Mobile EEG technology makes me think that this should be examined in these subpopulations to inform design to enhance perceptions and outcomes.
Yes. I always appreciate the science, the folk who understand the science behind this, because I'm just a park designer, and it's maybe the point here is it's the collaborations like this that make the difference.
Let's see, there was somebody asked, what is a letterboard?
Oh, just it's just a communication device. When kids like Lydia's has a digital letterboard, but all it is it can be symbols or letters or phrases, and it's just for kids learning to communicate. So you can have someone touch the letterboard and respond yes, no. Or the kid might have the ability to touch the letterboard themselves. In Lydia's case, she has like a yes, no button that then can activate her digital communication device. So they're all just ways of trying to figure out for nonverbal kids ways to allow them to communicate.
Thank you. Let's see, there was, okay, so from, I might have skipped some. So from Daniel, Mark, what are your thoughts on connecting your ideas and strategies here with children's rights and especially children's agency, voice, and participation in decision making in their play settings, etc.?
Oh, I appreciate that. There's two funny answers. Well, one funny answer and one serious answer. One a joke like I mentioned. I think Danae and I have changed 36,000 diapers for Lydia over the 12 years, and we I mean it's 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. 200 seizures. You're managing a lot, 100 to 200. I say this only because what I'm realizing is uh, parents of kids with disabilities, if you go on the Facebook groups, you'll see the moms like they're completely exhausted. So one of the things I'm noticing within like a disability equity movement is the parents literally don't have the energy to do the political action. It's just hard enough to take care of your family. And to me, I'd love it if some group would emerge that would support parents with disability that does do the political action, obviously, in tying all these things together. But it's one thing I've noticed about this equity group. Yeah, they're pretty exhausted. They don't have energy to do much beyond the typical, you know, if you got 2 hours free on the weekend, it's a bonus.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be wonderful if that could happen, but I would love it if some of the groups could emerge that would help support parents to be, really frank about it.
Well, thanks for sharing that out as a need. And,
Mm.
we have, a lot of people participating in this webinar and a lot of great thinkers and a lot of great connections. So who knows? You never know what might come out of a webinar like this. We are at time. So I put a couple of links in the chat and information about our upcoming, we have a teacher webinar on Saturday. And I also put the evaluation in the chat. I will also send these links and the evaluation and the presentation PDF and the follow-up email that'll go out hopefully sometime next week. But the evaluation helps us provide feedback to our presenters and also helps us know what you all are interested in terms of future webinars. There were lots of great comments in the chat, so thanks for everyone's participation and thoughtfulness. And you can save the transcript, and I think you can save the chat as well, but you'll get a chance to read the entirety, Mark. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and close out the webinar. Again, we thank everyone for participating and being involved and learning more about Lydia and Mark and how they're working to make big changes in parks and other areas, landscapes to get kids with and families with disabilities outdoors. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thanks, folks, for listening today.